Well, good evening and welcome. 34th Annual Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz Lecture Series on National Security Affairs. We're delighted that you're with us tonight. Just a quick public service announcement. When we have concluded for the evening, I think I'll pop back up here, but we will have refreshments, beverages, and some snacks after this evening's lecture series is concluded. I'm done talking, except it is my pleasure to introduce Dean Bob Jacobson. He is the Dean for Undergraduate Studies within the Colleges of Letters and Science. He is my direct report here on campus for all the RTC units. And tonight he will be introducing our guest speaker, Admiral Blair. So Dean Jacobson.
So it's very interesting for Berkeley to have a lecture in honor of Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz. Everybody knows him as a titanic historical figure who had a huge role in the struggle of the Second World War. But there's an important context to Nimitz's success. Before that time, he spent the early part of his career working on some of the most complex and difficult issues for the Navy. When it wasn't clear how propulsion for submarines or the integration of aviation would work, whether it would work at all, he took the risk of spending a significant fraction of his career working on that. And after that, he got involved in one of the most difficult problems for any large organization, which is people. The issue of growing and stretching and extending the organization and its people through the next generation. As part of that, he founded our ROTC detachment here at Berkeley, but he also addressed personnel issues throughout the entire Navy. And as all of those efforts, in a very large sense, were forerunners to both his success, the Navy's success, and the nation's success during the Second World War. And that kind of commitment to taking on important questions, to seeing them through to a solution that perhaps was not visible at the beginning, and to advance both themselves and the country are one of the core values of what we hope Berkeley can be. This is what we train people to do. In that spirit, I'm very pleased to welcome tonight's Nimitz speaker, Admiral Dennis Blair. Although he isn't a Berkeley ROTC graduate, he substituted the Naval Academy on a Rhodes Scholarship for that. He went on to a very effective career in the Navy, working with destroyers, commanding a battle group, and eventually ending up as being responsible for operations over approximately half of the planet as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Command, the oldest and largest of the combatant commands. But also, in that spirit of broad engagement, the thing that we hold out at Berkeley as a highest ideal, he worked in policy positions in the government for the Navy, the National Security Council, and I love this, in housing and urban development, because of course, as everybody who's a Berkeley student knows, housing is one of the most complicated problems to solve. Culminating in being the Director of National Intelligence, which I have to admit might be more complicated than Berkeley's housing problem. He continues to engage the world across a broad fund of activities, some of which you can read about in the program. And so I am so pleased to welcome here tonight on behalf of the ROTC and the entire Berkeley community as our Nimitz lecturer, and I look forward very much to his remarks.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction. It's great to be here at Berkeley, and particularly to give a lecture founded in honor of Admiral Nimitz, who's always been one of my naval heroes. I had the honor of having most of the job that he had 50 years later under entirely different conditions. As I'm going to say in remarks, there are a few things that I wish he'd fixed while he had the job that we're dealing with to this day, but a real not only naval hero, but national figure who made a big difference for this country. So this evening, I'd like to talk about the history and the future of East Asia, or as we ocean-focused, acronym-loving Navy sailors like to call it, Westpac. It was where I spent virtually all of my seagoing Navy career, And the course it takes will have a strong and powerful influence on the kind of world that we will have in coming years. And after years of peace and progress, there are strains and tensions growing in that region that we will have to deal with. So it's worth reviewing the recent history of this part of the world. It's not always been at peace. For nearly half a century before 1979, it was convulsed by fighting. It began in China through World War II, when Admiral Nimitz played a big part in it, through the hot phase of the Cold War, which took place in Korea, first in Korea, and finally in the wars of Southeast Asia. The conflicts began when the Japanese invasion of Manchuria took place in 1931. Fighting raged on in China for 10 years until Pearl Harbor widened the conflict to the entire Pacific. That conflict ended with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but for another 33 years there were shooting wars in East Asia, from the Yalu River to Quemoy and Matsu to Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The last major battle out in that part of the world was in 1979, when the Chinese took heavy losses during a large-scale punitive raid into North Vietnam to teach them a lesson, as the Chinese phrased it. Now, the United States was heavily involved in these wars. From the conflict in China, some remember the Panay Incident of 1937, through World War II, operations around Taiwan, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. So American involvement in East Asia goes back a long way. We have a stake in the region, a stake that we have supported and defended in blood and treasure for many, many years. But since 1979, there's been peace, economic development, and political evolution in East Asia. It now has the single largest share of the world's economy of any region. It's lifted more of its citizens out of poverty than any other region of the world. And democracies, some well-developed, some still struggling, have formed since then in South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia. And there have been three major factors that underlie that period of peace and security and development in East Asia. First was a settlement, either a settlement or a stalemate of those legacy issues from those 40 years of war. Colonial issues, some of them, Cold War issues, some of them. Second factor, a general sort of war weariness in the region after the enormous convulsions of war during that time. People got tired of it. Leaders got tired of it. And third, and important, the predominance of the air and maritime power of the United States, which was and is during that time pretty much a status quo country in East Asia without territorial ambitions of its own in that region. Now, unsettled issues from these prior conflicts have carried over into the present, but they are either stalemated or maintained by political and military balances. The Korean War ended with an armed truce. A peace treaty has still not been signed between the United States and North Korea. That armed truce is maintained by a military alliance between the United States and the Republic of Korea, supported by a UN guarantee and given strong effect by the stationing of an American division in South Korea and our nuclear guarantee. The confrontation between Taiwan and China, the tail end of the Chinese Civil War, went on into the 1950s, involved both localized engagements and American nuclear threats in that region, and ended in another stalemate. Peace has been maintained there by Taiwan's own defensive capabilities and a conditional American security guarantee, which is codified in the Taiwan Relations Act. The colonial wars of Southeast Asia ended with withdrawal of all of the European colonial powers, Netherlands, France, United Kingdom, Portugal, and then of the United States. The new governments of these countries formed the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, which served generally as a tension-relieving communications forum focused on regional economic development. So there are a series of either settlements or military stalemates that have carried on to the present time, and there are still other unresolved territorial issues. These range from the northern territories, which were taken over by the Soviet Union from Japan at the very end of the Second World War and are still an issue between those two countries, through several islands in the East China Sea that are disputed between South Korea and Japan, or between China and Japan, down to Southeast Asia, in which the claims of China, The Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam all conflict. However, until fairly recently, for most of these conflicting claims, there was a general recognition, a general tacit agreement that the countries would agree to disagree, that no side involved would take major military moves to change the status quo. And besides, island grabbing involves sea and air power, and it was the United States that dominated the sea and the airspace of East Asia and made it clear that we did not support any changes to the status quo by force. So with the major contentious issues of the region either stalemated, solved, or shelved, and American power dominant in the maritime regions, the countries of the regions, with the exception, the glaring exception of North Korea, kept their military expenditures low and turned their energies to economic development. Japan spent less than 1% of its gross domestic product on defense. The Japanese economic recovery from the ruin of 1945 was the first of the series of economic miracles in the region. The formula was high-quality, low-cost manufacturing of a wide range of consumer and industrial products, government support of key industries, and then selling into the American market. South Korea followed the Japanese pattern a few years later, in some cases taking business from Japanese competitors. Then came the three so-called Asian tigers, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, that followed the South Korean example of private enterprise, strong state support for business and exports, and an open American market. And then finally, in about 1979, China acknowledged that Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution had been disasters, observed the success of other countries in the region, and decided to start its own journey down that same road. And the result was a run of double-digit economic growth that continued till about 3 years ago, the escape of 300 million of its citizens from poverty and the second largest national economy in the world. And finally, this combination of a stable security architecture in East Asia, little incentive and high risks for military aggression by any major country, economic prosperity led into democratic political change in many countries. As in the case of both the military and the economic development, the United States played a key role, both by example and by specific actions to favor democratic transitions. In South Korea, the move away from authoritarian government began in the 1980s, the early 1980s, culminated in President Chun's decision not to run for president in 1986. In the Philippines, about the same time, popular demonstrations, elections pushed President Marcos out of power, and it was the United States that in fact took him out of his country and stashed him away where he couldn't cause any more trouble. In Taiwan, President Lee was elected first by the National Assembly, then by popular election in 1996. And in Indonesia, President Suharto resigned in 1998 with American blessing. So I must tell you that when I was Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Command from 1999 to 2002, I was feeling pretty good about the position of the United States in the region. Things were very much going our way. Security architecture was solid, economic growth was continuing, and the form of governance that the United States favored, democratic representative government, and that form of government that was very much in its interests and in American interests, was gaining ground. So what's happened in the last 15 years that has changed that very favorable situation? And more important, what is it that we can do about it? The single most important development has been the rise of China. During the 1990s, military modernization was the fourth of four of China's modernization, put at the end of the list behind a series of economic modernizations that it concentrated on. However, as China's economic success continued, it generated the resources for funding that fourth modernization, and the country began to allocate serious resources to its military forces. Meanwhile, the People's Liberation Army had been studying warfare, had realized how far behind it had fallen. Chinese military planners were surprised by the rapid American victory in the first Gulf War in 1991 against what was then the fourth largest army in the world, fighting in its own backyard. And then a few years later was chagrined by its inability to counter two American battle groups that were sent to Taiwan in 1996 in response to Chinese threats. So it was determined, the Chinese armed forces were determined not to remain a backward force. So as China poured 10 to 12% annual budget increases into its armed forces, it pursued four sensible objectives: to transform its infantry-heavy, immobile land forces into modernized mobile forces with networked command and control capabilities and modern weapons, to increase its maritime power with an emphasis initially on submarines, later on surface ships, and now beginning to build aircraft carriers of its own, and increasing its air power, both with fighters and with surface-to-air missile systems, and then finally building a huge inventory of surface-to-surface missiles of various ranges and lethality. And with those sort of budget increases and a pretty sensible plan for building its military capability, China became very powerful very quickly. There were other events that contributed to China's growing conviction that its power and position were increasing and that its day was coming. The 2008 Olympics, it was a public relations and psychological milestone, sort of on the pattern of Tokyo in 1960, Seoul in 1988. In 2010, China passed Japan as the world's second largest economy. And meanwhile, the United States was suffering a pair of self-inflicted wounds during the same period that diminished our stature. The 2003 invasion of Iraq with no allies, no plan for rebuilding the country after victory, and some very tough military challenges following it. And then the 2008-2009 financial crisis that wrecked the US economy and took a broad swath of the world economy with it. So by 2012, when Xi Jinping became president, the attitude among the Chinese ruling elite was that it was on the rise, US was on the skids, and it was just a matter of time before China would become the dominant country in East Asia, and even went on to displace the United States as the most powerful country in the world, primarily economic power, but maybe eventually military power as well. Xi Jinping fully shared this attitude, and he added a dimension of impatience. Rather than waiting for power and influence to shift its way due to its remarkable economic and development, China should undertake more aggressive program, economic mercantilism, political coercion, to build its influence and take a more active approach to the historical task of reclaiming both the territory and the power that it felt was its birthright. This new, more aggressive policy played out most dramatically in Southeast Asia and the South China Sea, where China has taken dramatic steps, which have been widely reported, to buttress its legally risible claim that virtually the entire sea is Chinese territory. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles to the north, North Korea was also challenging the status quo. Overall, political, economic, and military balances had been tilting dramatically against the despotic regime of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. It had lost its two primary patrons, the Soviet Union and China. Its economy was a shambles, and its conventional military forces, while large, were falling ever further behind the combined power of South Korean and American forces. Kim Jong-un, the third-generation scion of the Kim dynasty, took power in 2011. He consolidated his personal power through ruthless elimination of potential rivals, including a public arrest and execution of an uncle, and the assassination of a half-brother in Malaysia using nerve gas. He managed to stabilize the North Korean economy by allowing gray markets to make up for the massive inefficiency of the official command economy. And he put North Korean nuclear weapons and long-range missile development programs into high gear and initiated an aggressive diplomatic campaign designed to intimidate and wring concessions from South Korea, the United States, Japan, and to a lesser extent, Russia and China. So these are the twin East Asian security challenges of our time, dealing with a powerful and increasingly impatient China and a missile and nuclear-armed North Korea. So let's deal with North Korea first. My policy recommendations are the same as those of most of us who have long-time experience in dealing with North Korea. I was a battle group commander off the Korean Peninsula in 1994 when the United States came close to launching attacks on the plutonium-producing reactor at Yongbyon. I was the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Command when the Clinton administration came close to negotiating successful nuclear agreements under the framework of the six-party talks. And then I was director of national intelligence when a North Korean submarine sank the South Korean frigate Chonan. So I've seen both the aggressive side of North Korean actions and the North Korean diplomatic gambits. North Korean leaders have maneuvered for decades, often in quite ingenious ways, to strengthen their power, to frighten their enemies, to move towards their goal of reunifying the Korean Peninsula under their control. But they've always recognized that they have to do that without igniting a general war, which jeopardizes all of their goals, and they've been careful not to risk major conflict as they've done this combination of military provocations and diplomatic maneuvering. And unlike some who seem to have come more recently to deal with North Korean issues, I am firmly convinced that North Korea, even with long-range missiles and with nuclear warheads that can reach some American territory and might work if they were actually shot there, can be deterred from using them by the far superior conventional and nuclear capability of the United States and its allies in that part of the world. Kim Jong-un, like his father, like his grandfather, is brutal, despotic, ruthless, but he's not suicidal. And the use of nuclear weapons against the United States will result in the end of his country, his regime, and his life, and he knows that. So we can expect challenges from cyber attacks to military provocations to nuclear threats to clever political maneuvering, as we've seen during the recent Olympics and in the days following. We can prevent major conventional or nuclear attacks so long as we keep our alliances with North Korea and Japan modernized and our nuclear arsenal strong. And the best policy for the United States is to continue to maintain military readiness, conventional and nuclear, to deter major war, to keep enormous economic and diplomatic pressure on North Korea that makes life as miserable as we can for the elites that support Kim Jong-un, the army, the security services, the propaganda bureaus. And we will have to deal firmly with military provocations, sometimes retaliating with limited strikes of our own. We should greatly increase the flow of information from the outside world into North Korea. There are mobile phones that connect to Chinese cell towers that are on the western bank of the Yalu River, and the estimates are that fully a fifth of North Koreans have access to them. So information can come in from outside. We can flood North Korea with thumb drives, DVDs, with news about the rest of the world. There can be radio and TV broadcasts that North Koreans can listen to clandestinely, and we know from the accounts of defectors that even though the risks are great, many North Koreans are willing to run those risks to find out what's going on in the rest of the world. And eventually, as have all such regimes before it, the Kim regime will fall when the elites understand just how terrible that regime is for their country, that they can do better, and when they find ways, despite the police state in which they live, to remove him and his family from power. So what about dealing with China? In the first place, I think it's important not to blindly extrapolate China's dramatic economic and military gains of the recent past into the future. China faces big headwinds. It's climbing a demographic hill. In fact, its workforce is now shrinking in numbers and will shrink for many years. The corruption is rife that no number of centralized investigations and publicized prosecutions will halt. What you really need to beat it down is a free press, independent judiciary, and these are measures that the Chinese Communist Party will not take. The pollution of its air and water that will require huge resources over many years to remediate and will put a heavy tax on economic development, but is being demanded by Chinese citizens. And most important, the fundamental economic restructuring that China has to accomplish in order to continue to grow. Its past growth was sustained by a set of very difficult but very simple policies. Investments in infrastructure, export-led manufacturing growth, but that string has basically run out. As it announced at the third plenum in 2012, China has decided it must rely on market-driven forces, service industries, private sector growth. However, the first 6 years since those reforms were announced have been years of very patchy implementation of the aspiration. The recent announcement that Xi Jinping will continue as China's ruler for the indefinite future will not help it to overcome these obstacles. It's clear that President Xi's primary interests are gathering more power into his own hands and expanding China's influence overseas. His signature initiatives are the Belt and Road Initiative, which is massive Chinese investment in transportation infrastructure overseas, emphasizing the development of China's maritime power and in support of its overseas interests, and at home cracking down on all forms of potential challenge to his power. The economic reforms that China must undertake to keep growing do not receive the same level of attention and emphasis, and many of the important ones have stalled under his leadership. So how do we deal with China in the future? In the past, U.S. policy towards China has been preoccupied with China's future development rather than realistic actions that deal with its current behavior. The primary objective of our policy was to shape China's development for it to become, in the memorable phrase of Bob Zellick, a responsible stakeholder. American leaders had hoped to convince China that they are not seeking to contain it, hoping that China's actions would moderate as it becomes more powerful and influential. They feared that strong reactions to even egregious Chinese economic, political, and military actions would cause China to become aggressive and generate an overall hostile strategy. They characterized aggressive Chinese actions as differences that need to be discussed and took relatively mild actions against Chinese military aggression, paramilitary aggression in the South China Sea, against Chinese intellectual property theft from this country and from others. And the emphasis in policy had been to affect China's future behavior rather than its future trajectory rather than its current behavior. But for the future, we really need to deal with China as it is. It's the second largest economy in the world. It's still growing rapidly as it attempts to transform its economy. It's actively working to become the largest economy in the world, a leader in the most advanced technologies, industries, and services, using control of its own market and an aggressive interpretation of WTO norms in the rest of the world. It's using its economic power for coercion, for example, most recently in South Korea, to try to influence the South Koreans to refuse to accept the deployment of theater area air defense missiles. And previously, it used that kind of economic power against Japan by cutting off rare earth materials during the Senkaku's incident. It's developed the largest armed forces in Asia. It uses its military power freely for coercion, gunboat diplomacy in the East and South China Seas, and it also has operational plans to use its growing military forces to retake territory in what it sees as its rightful sphere of influence on its maritime borders in Asia. Now, I'm not forgetting that China is also important in the international solution to many issues, containing North Korea, restricting Iran's nuclear development, more generally in dealing with nuclear proliferation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. However, we need to treat these issues also not only as just as indicators of potential benign intent by China, but as actions, or as actions to be rewarded by giving a pass to China in other areas, but as issues in which the United States and China have shared interests and can therefore cooperate. Nothing more, nothing less. In dealing with China, we should use both carrots and sticks to handle current issues. We should not fear that straight talk and penalties will somehow discourage China from developing into a responsible stakeholder. We have to maintain our military edge in the Pacific, cooperating closely with our allies and partners in the region. China's nearly 20 years now of double-digit military budget increases have cut into the wide margin of American military superiority in the Western Pacific. However, at the end of any fight, over the Senkaku Islands, over Taiwan, in the South China Sea, China would not be in control of its island objectives against opposition by the United States. So we need to continue the investments in military capability that is forward stationed and can be brought to bear in the Western Pacific, so that remains the case. A balance like this will give China every incentive to extend their power and influence by economic and diplomatic means rather than be tempted to use military means. And in the economic area, we need to deal with aggressive Chinese policies with competitive moves of our own, including sanctions when necessary. China makes no secret of its ambition to be the world leader in key areas of the future world economy. Its blueprint for a dominant position in high-tech manufacturing is described in an authoritative government set of policies which are aptly called Made in China 2025. Now, in some areas, personal information technology comes to mind. China has legitimately developed world-class technology and companies of its own. However, in too many others, high-speed rail, wind turbines, chemicals, medical devices, Chinese companies with encouragement and often the active assistance of the Chinese government have stolen advanced technology from international companies, nurtured Chinese companies in a protected domestic market, and then competed in international markets with heavy government subsidies against the companies that they stole the ideas from in the beginning. The United States has filed a record number of cases with the World Trade Organization and won many of them, but this is not enough. We need to identify the companies that have stolen intellectual property or otherwise acted in ways that we don't allow American companies to act, and then deny the U.S. market to them. They should not be allowed to export to the U.S. market, to raise capital in the United States, nor to clear their dollar transactions through U.S. banks. And we should encourage our allies in the European Union and Japan to take the same actions. If China continues to deny its markets to international companies, we should not allow its companies to operate freely in ours. The United States also needs a more comprehensive geopolitical strategy for dealing with the Chinese action, which they call cabbage slicing in the South Pacific, small actions taken by mostly non-military forces to extend Chinese jurisdiction into that part of the world. The U.S. needs more than simply periodic military deployments to preserve our access to and our influence in that region. We need to help form an overall multilateral diplomatic and military strategy to support a stable international settlement of the many overlapping interests in that region. There are 4 other countries in Southeast Asia, each of them weaker than China, that have conflicting claims to portions of the South China Sea. And that gives China a lot of running room to advance its interests from everything from territorial claims to hydrocarbon exploitation to fishing enforcement. So we should encourage the other claimants to agree on an overall settlement of the conflicting claims that takes into account current possessions, compromising on deserted features that nobody actually occupies, and using joint development areas to divide the revenues from economic development of these regions. The claimants should offer China participation in this process to solve conflicting claims. China would most likely refuse, would certainly refuse, I would say, but the process should go on, and China should be allotted a fair share of the islands and resources of the region based on their legitimate claims. Once such a settlement has been reached, the United States, Japan, other outside countries could recognize and support it. And then we would have a real policy basis to accept some Chinese moves, to reject or oppose others. And we would have a basis to support or reject the positions and actions of Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, and to provide focused assistance to them in maintaining their legitimate rights. But let me emphasize once more that although my recommendations include a number of firm actions that would be taken against China, I am not describing a strategy of overall containment of China. China's power and influence will grow in East Asia and elsewhere around the world. However, as China grows, as the United States cooperates with China in some areas, and the companies of the 2 countries cooperate and compete around the world, the United States needs to defend its interests when China encroaches on them. So over the past 80 years, East Asia has been on a roller coaster. It went through 40 years of war, causing enormous human suffering, widespread physical damage, and more recently have come 40 years of incredible economic, political, and societal process. New tensions are coming up, and there's a question of what will be the third phase? Will it be the phase of conflict, or will it be the phase of security and progress? The United States has been deeply involved in East Asia that entire time, for that entire 80 years. Our stake in Asia has been and remains large. And so it will take a great amount of wisdom, courage, and persistence to forge American policies, to put them into action that can prolong the peaceful and positive trend of the last 4 decades and project those on into the future. Thank you very much, and I think we ought to turn this into a discussion. So any questions or smart remarks from the midshipmen here? Sir.
Good evening, sir. Midshipman 3rd Class McCann, UC Berkeley Chemistry. Sir, I had a question regarding China's influence abroad, specifically in Africa. Thanks. Sir, I was wondering if the Chinese economic investment into countries in Africa is an area of concern for the United States.
All right. The question is the influence of heavy Chinese economic investment in Africa, and you could say the same in South America and in other parts of the in other parts of the world. If you talk to your friends in other countries about the only thing they like to get from China is the money, and China has it, and it's splashing it around quite freely. And who wouldn't take money? Fewer strings attached, the better. And so that does give China a certain amount of influence. On the other hand, China is a little bit new to this overseas influence game, and it often it splashes the money around with a lot of downsides for the countries that have accepted it. Part of the reason that China is going abroad is that it wants to soak up some of the surplus excess capacity of the infrastructure companies in China itself, which have in many cases run out of profitable projects to run. So they go overseas. So often a Chinese economic contract in Africa, in South America, and other countries will be carried out by Chinese workers who are brought in, lived in separate camps, set it up, and the country who's the recipient of this may simply get a finished structure of some kind. No employment was generated during the time. No skills have been left behind to local workers, and in many cases, a huge burden of debt has been left behind as China financed these projects. In addition, there are very few countries with any sort of aspirations to representative government that think that the Chinese government model is a good one to follow. There are a number of dictators who think it's just you can learn some things from China about how to control the internet, how to deal with dissidents, how to make sure the bruises don't show when you beat them up, that kind of stuff. But there are not many countries that look to China for inspiration in terms of their government. So the main thing China has going for it is the money. And I think there's one thing that we learned with the Soviet Union in the Cold War years, that countries, even quite weak countries, are richly capable of taking huge amounts of aid from superpowers and then asking them not to make a big mess when they leave. Thank you very much. And these do not translate necessarily directly into influence over decisions of those countries that involve their true national interests. So I think that in general, I'm not that worried about China going out and making a lot of these investments. The infrastructure requirements in Africa, in South Asia, in South America are huge, in the trillions of dollars, and if China can put in some contribution to doing that, that's probably a good thing. The countries themselves are pretty sophisticated about accepting what's useful to them and not allowing great influence over their important decisions. And so far, China has not developed the military capability to put that into these countries and force them to do things that they don't want to do. So I think that it can be a good thing. And some of the smart Chinese companies and government officials are learning to do it better, to operate with less of these toxic side effects when they go in and help other countries, and that's all to the good. Oh, over here on this side, yep.
Thanks, sir. Two questions, if you will. Talking about the ox tongue, let's go back to 1982 and the law of the sea. Would our position today be better if we had signed that, or is it just a cipher in history? Number two, talking about the agreed framework, is it your opinion if that had somehow staggered through to success, we wouldn't be in the situation we are now today? And in a melancholy fact that perhaps we were a bit more responsible than the other side for its demise. Thank you.
Right. On the UN Convention on Law in the Sea, there's no question that we should ratify that law. We're in a much weakened position by being only signatories, not full partners. I've been personally part of 3 or 4 efforts to try to convince 60 members of the Senate to pass that treaty, and there's always been a hard opposition that keeps changing its rationale for why it opposes it, that has prevented it from happening. Right now, we observe the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but we are not part of it, and therefore we're not a member of the bodies that are charged to enforce it and to carry it out. We have to rely on our friends and allies to do that, and it puts us in a much weaker position, and we ought to change that. Most recently, as those of you who follow these things know, one of the tribunals set up to enforce disputes under the law of the sea mechanism ruled across the board against China in its claims in the South China Sea. And China is not, China says that the ruling was invalid and that they're not going to follow it. And we say, yes, you should follow the ruling of the law of the sea of the panel, but we're not quite ready to ratify it ourselves. So it just puts us in a weaker position than we should be in. Six-party framework. This was former Defense Secretary William Perry doing an incredibly skillful job of going around to Republic of Korea, Japan, China, Russia, North Korea itself to try to basically make an agreement with the North Koreans that they would give up their plutonium-based nuclear weapons program in return for a whole series of economic favors. The North Koreans appeared to be willing to give up their plutonium-based weapons program. Meanwhile, they hid successfully an enriched uranium program which was capable of generating weapons which they were going to keep. And finally, a couple of years later, they basically proudly said themselves that they had it. So fundamentally, had the United States agreed to that, we would have been able to control a limited amount of plutonium that could make, depending on what you believe, a few nuclear weapons, and meanwhile the enriched uranium program would have gone on and created that many and many more. So probably not a real good deal from the American point of view. In the last minute, there were key elements that were not agreed as the Clinton administration was running out of time, and they primarily had to do with verification. And it's clear in retrospect that that North Korea wanted to keep the verification regimes loose enough that they could continue to hide their uranium enrichment program. And I remember at the end, the North Koreans said, if President Clinton comes to visit us, we'll make sure we make the right concessions. You don't send your president to a country on a promise. You only send your president to bless a deal when it's actually been nailed down. So, whose fault was it that it fell apart? United States perhaps bears some responsibility. I think North Korea bears more. Would it have been a good deal given that there was this entire separate program that it wouldn't have covered, that would have made North Korea a nuclear power? Pretty important loophole. So I think it's sort of a mixed judgment on that framework. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening, sir. Midshipman, third class McKinney, UC Berkeley. You've mentioned that some East Asian countries are currently struggling to develop their democracies. I'm currently thinking of the Philippines, which have to send over migrant workers to African and Middle Eastern countries in order to support their economies.
Right.
Particularly like the United Arab Emirates, where they incur a lot of human rights violations, and they ultimately consume a fraction of the gross national income there. What do you think of these almost stagnant economies and democracies that are basically hitting a stopping point where they're unable to currently continue developing themselves?
Right. I'm on the board of Freedom House, which has for almost 40 years done a very careful survey of the state of democracy and freedom in the world, rates every country and puts out extensive literature on its evaluations. Just hit freedomhouse.org and you'll see it. And the general, when you look at it over time, you learn that maintaining a functioning democracy is a tough task, and you never finish it. Things slide back, things move forward. And the Philippines has had as much of a roller coaster ride in that area as many countries do. And its current president is not helping matters much by the way that he approaches the responsibilities of a president of a democracy. One election, one time, and then go do what you want. And so the aspect that you talk about of the Philippine diaspora, of people who can't get jobs there and go for work elsewhere, send remittances back to their families, are themselves often subjected to pretty harsh behavior in the countries where they work, whether it's the Middle East or Africa or other places, is I think one aspect of that, because you don't have these are people with a certain amount of gumption and hard work, and you'd like to have them back working in their own country, putting pressure on the government to stand by what it's supposed to do, and to build the right form of governance within their own country. So what I've learned about it over the years is that the foundation of democratic development, a generally representative government, institutions that citizens trust if they take a case to court, a relatively open press that can expose things that are going wrong, and armed forces that's under control of the elected government, not carving out its own autonomous area like it does in Thailand or Myanmar or places like that. That these things basically have to be worked by the people themselves, and those of us outside in other countries can set an example, provide a certain amount of help, avoid supporting the dictators and the bad guys for other purposes when we can, and that it can. That's the way you make progress in this area. And I think in the Philippines, the sort of foundations of a representative government are pretty strong. When a president sits around too long and becomes too oppressive, people take to the streets, as they did with Marcos, as they've done subsequently, and so the leader can be forced out, and the army and the other powerful institutions will not support him. The other hard part of creating the institutions that will support that over time is something where the Philippines have fallen short over the years, and that's really where they need the work. I have lots of Philippine friends that you can talk about it with them, and pretty much in these terms, and it's really sort of something that they have to get themselves together to do. On the side, sir.
Good evening, sir. Midshipman Third Class Liston, UC Berkeley, Political Economy. In the past few days, there have been a lot of talks about the imposition of tariffs on steel and aluminum on other nations. And from what I've read, I think that's a violation of the WTO, which you talked about. China has violated a lot too, except in the cases of national security, those tariffs can't be imposed. And so I was just wondering your thoughts on what kind of precedents that sets in the region, as other countries have said that they will plan to take the United States to court with the WTO,
Right.
and how that will influence future interactions between, namely, the U.S. and China.
Well, it looks like we're going to find out. And I'm sure there are 100 members of the Berkeley faculty who are more knowledgeable on these economic questions, and there are thousands of people in the Bay Area who are more qualified on an actual business basis to decide it. I guess my observation is that the actions like this will have a certain number of actual consequences in terms of sales being lost and companies being hurt and so on. But they're symbolic, and their influential power is what really matters, and they lead to adjustments by countries in other areas. So I think that I think that there's a high symbolic content to the United States taking an action, which, as you said, is probably, we will probably lose a WTO case. We will probably hurt some of our allies, as well as some of our adversaries who were the ones that we really want to penalize by it. And then there'll be sort of a reshuffling of the deck, and hopefully at the end of that reshuffle, there will be a set of actions taken by everybody who has skin in the game that will end up being different and better for the United States than we are now. If what I've learned in the economy is if something is too bad to believe, it'll probably change eventually. So all the people I know who seem to know about it say that these actions should have been much more targeted, much more precise against Chinese steel making, which can produce twice as much steel as the world needs, and these full tariffs on imported steel and aluminum are going to. I think we only import 2% of our steel from China. Most of it comes from other countries who are going to be hit by this. So the system will adjust, and the question will have been: what is this? Is the influence of this pretty brute tool that was chosen generally positive over the long run, or is it not? And I don't know how to predict that. We'll see. I don't think you'll be paying too much more for your aluminum soda cans, but that may not be a bad thing. Yeah. Yeah. Again, sir.
Yes, sir. In the last year or so, we've been very belligerent toward North Korea in a military way. Do you think that has any bearing on the recent news? It seems to be more conciliatory and agreement-based, or was that just a exercise in some sort of futility and other factors were responsible for that? Thank you.
Right. The North Koreans don't believe their own propaganda. There's no reason they ought to believe ours. So I don't think the words had that much to do with it. For years, we've played the Gary Cooper role. For those of you who are old enough to know who Gary Cooper was, we're the strong, silent type. You know, we'll meet you at the OK Corral, but we ain't going to talk about it much until we get there. And we just sort of brushed aside these outrageous things that North Koreans say. I have South Korean friends, and I read English translations of running dog, imperialist, bleeding tooth, and I go to my South Korean friends. Is that what it really says in South Korean? I mean in Korean, are those the real words? And apparently, North Korea has preserved a vocabulary of words that nobody uses in the Republic of Korea anymore, which are specially applied to North Korea's enemies. So they just have this propaganda thing, tied down. So in a way, it doesn't bother me for our guy to be calling them names when they've been calling us names. Now, it's kind of like pig wrestling. The pig gets dirty, you get dirty. The pig likes it, you don't. So there is that aspect to it. But I don't mind calling out the North Koreans' leadership, and I don't think it has a real effect. I think what we're seeing here is a long-time North Korean pattern of taking a bunch of provocative actions that put them on a trajectory towards what might be a real confrontation with the United States. And then they sort of level off and say, well, should we talk about this? And can we get a little bit of more economic help? Can you recognize our status as a higher political set of prerogatives than we used to have previously? And how about talking with us directly and not talking with your ally South Korea? And so they use this pattern of provocation followed by negotiation as a technique, and it's just infuriating when you watch it on a day or a year-by-year basis. That to see that this impoverished country that has nothing can be sitting at the same table with respectable countries that have done a lot for their people, and they seem to be able to pull that off. On the other hand, if you step back and look at the big picture, the only thing you have to look at is that famous picture of the Korean Peninsula taken from a satellite at night, in which the DMZ is a sharp line, Below it, you see city lights, lights in small towns, obviously a bustling economy that with a per capita income that has just risen dramatically over recent decades. And then north of the DMZ, it's absolutely black. People are grubbing around for a living. Large numbers are sent to concentration camps. They're punished for the slightest show of disloyalty. And so in the big picture, American South Korean policy has been a great success, but it really does bug you that on these individual items, North Korea is able to wheedle a concession here and a concession there, and they're at it again. I mean, this statement that we've heard in the last couple of days that Kim Jong-un himself has said that, oh yes, we're willing to talk about giving up our nuclear weapons when we have absolute security on the peninsula, which means the United States and Republic of Korea no longer have a security treaty, which means all American troops have left the Korean peninsula. And after that is all done, then North Korea will think about getting rid of its nuclear weapons. I mean, we've seen this movie before, as Secretary Bob Gates said, how many times do we have to buy the same horse? And so I think that's the game book that North Korea uses. We have to be smart about it. We shouldn't refuse to talk to them at all, but we ought to have a pretty heavy dose of skepticism when we go into it. And of course, they have a tremendous sense of skepticism when they go into any negotiations with us. They're trying to take advantage of what they can get from us, not put themselves in a position of weakness. So as I've seen maybe 3 or 4 of these negotiations over the years, they do fall apart at the end. There isn't trust, and it's very difficult to develop an agreement when there's absolutely zero trust on both sides. So everything has to be written down and checked and be in the obvious interest of both sides. And I don't give that much hope for this current set of negotiations. And I could be wrong, but you know, I certainly would not bet a lot of my money on it. Other questions? Ma'am.
What do you think is the influence? Thank you. Hi. What do you think is the influence of U.S. higher education on Chinese nationals, and whether the influence is positive, negative, or neutral in China?
That's a very good question. I mean, are there any Chinese students who are studying here at Berkeley here in the audience? Okay, well, you have one expert there in the back, you know, I'm with those in general who think that studying in another country is an incredibly widening, important experience at a young age, which can give anybody who does it a wider view. An understanding that people in other countries are not just caricatures that you read about; they're real people, and they have a lot in common with you. I think and many times people who studied in other countries, particularly the United States, have become change agents when they come back to China, or when they come back to their countries, and they're obviously some of the bright people in those other countries, and when they rise to positions of power, they can make change. Unfortunately, the Chinese government is aware of that as well, and often takes measures to counteract what might be some of their bright young people coming to this country and absorbing heretical ideas like representative government, free press, the sort of unruly democratic system that is true in the United States and many countries. And so the Chinese government sort of watches people quite closely, stamps out ideas from being discussed on its own internet and groups among Chinese, including those who studied abroad and have come back. So what China is attempting to do is get all of the benefit of education in some of the best universities around the world, like this one and others, without its students coming home with ideas of actually changing the government, which the Chinese Communist Party very much believes is its prerogative and is not to be challenged at all. So it's kind of a contest there in terms of how is it going to work out. I think it's interesting. We have one Chinese student with us in this audience, but I'll bet there are several hundred at a minimum here at Berkeley, and the sheer number of Chinese students enables them to form really small colonies within universities. I've heard this from others. I haven't talked to people here at Berkeley, in which their contact with other people, Americans, other international students, is minimized, and they don't really get the life-forming experience that you have when you're plunged into a foreign environment and really have to come to grips with other ideas. There are little Chinese enclaves of just going to class, coming back, living with all your fellow Chinese, and then going home at the end of your education. I think that ought to be broken up so that students who come from not only China but many other countries get the full experience of what it's like in this country with Americans and others studying here. So, but all of those are quibbles. I think basically the more foreign students who come study in our universities, the better, and we ought to have the confidence in our country and in our institutions that they'll learn things here that will enable them to work with Americans in our country in the future for the good of both their countries. Yeah, sir.
Sir, I'm aware that China owns a large amount of our national debt.
Right.
What is your comments, your opinions on that situation?
Again, I'm sure there are members of the Berkeley faculty who know a lot more about that than I do, but those that I've talked to who've studied the question say that that's pretty much a standoff in terms of China and the United States, and neither can we use the fact that we owe China a lot of money, nor can they use the fact that they have a lot of our bonds, turn that into real coercive political power that can be used for either, to the benefit of either side. And there have been a lot of smart people on both sides trying to figure out how to do that. And it seems that about the best that can be done is to sort of keep it going and not let it get too much more extreme. You talk to anybody in Treasury about this issue and say, don't touch it, it's just let it exist there. I'm sure the same conversation takes place in the Chinese Ministry of Finance. So my experience watching this over time, that it's been pretty much of a wash. And it would be only if there were real conflict between the United States and China for other reasons that this would come into play. So it wouldn't be a causal factor. It wouldn't be something that could be used instead of military action to try to force the other country, us forcing China, China forcing us to do something. It would be something that would be sort of part of the wreckage of a war if we got into one. I think there was someone in the back there. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. I had a question about something you had said towards the end of your speech in one of your policy suggestions, being that we should not pursue a policy of containment when it comes to China. I want to ask why we shouldn't pursue such a policy when China is ideologically opposed to us in their authoritarian government and stand against the principles of the free market with trade tariffs as well as currency devaluation. Thank you, sir.
Right. I think the reason that the containment policy is associated with our policy against the Soviet Union, in which there was a sort of a huge, not only ideological difference, but a conflict over large swaths of influence over what was then the major, one of the major economic areas of the world of Europe. I think the competition that we have with China is based primarily on Chinese nationalism, not on some wider ideological movement that would build some sort of Chinese empire in which they would dominate a league of countries the way the Soviet Union did with the Warsaw Pact and the bloc that it had. And I also think that there is a good chance that the Chinese system, despite what we're seeing with the attempts by the current regime to continue to impose the one-party solution on China, there's a good chance that that may change over time. So the conditions don't seem to me that they are that our interests would be served in the long term by turning this into just a major our bloc against your bloc competition right now. So I think we can deal with the again the ideological attraction of the Chinese system is about zero in countries that you talk with around China. No one wants to turn their country into a China from a political point of view. Many envy Chinese economic success and want to take advantage of it, but it's not an ideological struggle in the way that the NATO versus the Warsaw Pact was, and I don't think we ought to turn it into one. China is taking a huge gamble that it can pull off what most other countries of Asia have not been able to pull off yet. If you looked at the authoritarian regimes in the Republic of Korea, in Taiwan, in Indonesia, and in other places, once the sophistication and development of the society reached a certain level, the economic development, the degree of understanding of what works and what doesn't in government, the other power centers in those countries looked at the regimes and said, "What value do you guys add? You know, you don't run very good businesses. You're just causing hostility by your external actions. It's we who are the ones who know what to do with our country, so step aside. We want to take over power." And this was done quite peacefully in Korea, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Taiwan. And the Chinese Communist Party is taking a bet that it can do it differently. It can hold on to power even though it adds no value to the economic and the social development of the country. And that's a pretty tough bet based on the history that we've seen in other countries, in other countries with similar authoritarian governments in the past. So I think our best strategy over the long term is make sure that we do the right thing for this country. God knows we have enough problems here that we need to improve, and we're losing time and not getting onto them. And then, as I mentioned in my remarks, stand off China when it wants to take military action to upset the international order, call them to account when they act economically in a mercantilist fashion against the systems that have been set up by the rest of the world. And then we sort of see whose system can develop over the long term, whose system is more attractive over the long term, what kind of a system the Chinese people want. And basically I would bet on a Chinese evolution over time, and I think that's the best way to handle it rather than turning this into some sort of containment ideological confrontation. Sir, over here.
Cadet Force Class Patterson. I was wondering if you could comment on the role of the Office of Director of National Intelligence. From your bio, I found that there was a little bit of conflict between you and the Director of the CIA, and kind of the role of the Director of National Intelligence as an office without an agency.
Right. I was the third Director of National Intelligence. It had been established after 9/11 out of the realization that we had enough pieces of intelligence spread throughout the different the 16 different agencies who have intelligence in their name to have stopped the 9/11 bombers, but our system was not set up so that the different agencies would share the information intelligence that they had, analyze it properly, and be able to see the attack was coming and then fend it off. So as a result of that, this Director of National Intelligence was created, whose job it was to pull them together and make sure that something like that didn't happen again. As it turned out, any sort of bureaucratic process of trying to bring agencies into a new structure creates a lot of antibiotics. It's putting happy children into an orphanage, and the DNI was the orphan master. So there was a certain amount of resistance among the intelligence agencies to being put in one place with one person in charge when they've been previously had quite a bit of autonomy and developed it. Now, in fairness, on the issue of countering terrorism, the intelligence community transformed itself completely. No one was ever going to sit on a piece of terrorist information again, having experienced the horror of 3,000 Americans being killed due to lack of sharing it. And in really a bottom-up way, the intelligence community formed task groups that shared information to the point that the worst thing that happened when I was Director of National Intelligence was a guy named Abdul Muttalib, a Nigerian who'd been trained in Yemen, was given what was called an underwear bomb, a new type of bomb invented to be able to get through the detection systems in airports, was on a plane coming into Detroit, tried to ignite the bomb in his skivvies, and luckily wasn't well trained enough to succeed, and he was subdued by the passengers. And when we went back and did the after-action review of that and determined what had happened, why hadn't we picked this guy up, why hadn't we do it, it turned out that the information had been freely shared. All information about this guy, Abdul Muttalib, was in the system. The people who had it had attempted to send it to everybody else, but the sheer volume of intelligence tips that was being sent around overwhelmed the analysts, and you found that the report on this guy was buried down in the stack with other things. So as far as terrorism went, the intelligence community really solved itself because of the strong reaction to 9/11, and the sharing of intelligence goes on spontaneously, and you almost didn't need a Director of National Intelligence to follow that up. So what happened bureaucratically was the agency said, "Gosh, it's going so well in terrorism. That's the reason it was originally found. Why do we need this extra set of authorities and eyes on top of us? Leave us alone to do our job the way we know how to do it previously." And there was active resistance to coming under the authority of the Director of National Intelligence. And because of the bureaucratic fighting that was involved in setting up the organization, the authorities given to the Director of National Intelligence were incomplete in terms of being able to actually order the intelligence agencies to work together. The consequence is that we are losing opportunities in other areas besides terrorism to get the most out of our intelligence. It turns out the intelligence secrets that you want are the ones that other countries or organizations are trying the hardest to keep. They're trying to hold on to them and then keep you from finding them out. So the best way to be able to get them is to form task groups of people whose job it is to recruit spies to find them out, to intercept emails and phones, to look at them from satellites, and form these action teams in which information is fully shared, and you come up with new creative ways to penetrate into the secrets of countries and organizations who are pretty good at keeping them from you. And that's really the authority that the Director of National Intelligence has to form those task groups on important intelligence matters, to force them to work hard. And to the extent that you undercut the authority of the Director of National Intelligence and don't give him the ability to do that, I think we lose opportunities in very important areas of intelligence. And that's sort of where we are now. The intelligence agencies say to the White House, hey, look, we're cooperating well on terrorism. Look at all the sharing we do. I know the Director of National Intelligence tells you that we're not doing very well on tough problems like where the North Korean nuclear weapons located and where the Iranian nuclear weapons located, but we're working on it. We can do that among ourselves just the way we did on terrorism, and we don't need this den mother in charge of us. And they've been pretty successful in making that argument. The main reason I left the job after a year and a half was that I was sort of old school, raised in the Navy. If you're put in charge of something, you tell people what to do, and they do it. A little naive, but and turned out I was wrong. The White House preferred to allow more autonomy to the intelligence organizations than I thought they ought to have, and so I ended up leaving. And that's sort of where we are now. The Director of National Intelligence has been able to do a few things that were obvious, low-hanging fruit that needed to be improved, but this commitment to integrating intelligence, putting it under one person whom you hold responsible for getting good results, and integrating these various forms of intelligence that we had, that idea has not been pushed through by either the Obama administration or currently the Trump administration, and we have this sort of mixed intelligence system, and there probably won't be much change unless there's another disaster, which of course we all hope will not take place. But most of the cost of not having a really integrated system with somebody ramrodding it is that we're missing opportunities. Yeah, in the back, sir.
Sir, Cadet Tong, UC Berkeley. And I have a two-part question, if you will. To what degree, or do you think a bright line exists between the rise of China and a threat to American national interests, or do you think those two are necessarily synonymous? And secondly, do you think to what degree does a rise of economic development and restructuring in China necessarily signal a lead to democratic political restructuring?
I mean, I think there's plenty of room in the world economy and in geopolitical world for the United States and China. I don't think some sort of clash is inevitable between us, as I said in response to a previous question, and I give full credit to China for the accomplishments, the most notable of which I think is improving the lives of hundreds of millions of Chinese people, and I think that they can go on to improve the lot of their people without putting undue pressure and influence on their neighbors. The Chinese have look out to the west in their maritime direction, and they have what they see as the first island chain, which they talk about in strategic terms. Well, we call the first island chain Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines. I mean, these are countries, independent countries, which pose no threat to China and which resent China achieving over them a sort of a veto over important national security decisions of their own that China feels are within its power because it's big and it needs to extend its defenses in a very wide manner. So I think that China has plenty of scope to improve the lives of its people, become a very powerful and influential country without gaining the sort of influence over the countries around it that it apparently seeks. South Korea is threatened by North Korean missiles, agrees with the United States that an anti-missile system should be brought into South Korea to defend against North Korean missiles. China says that this could be something that grows someday into a system which would threaten Chinese missiles and therefore puts enormous pressure on South Korea not to do it. South Korea says, oh, wait a minute, those missiles are pointing at me. This is a defense to do them. This action is not directed at you. In fact, it has nothing to do with you. It has to do with my defense. And China says, sorry, what's important here is what I think about what you're doing. And I don't think China either needs or has the right to have that sort of influence on the countries around it. So I think China can have plenty of security, plenty of prosperity, and all without the sort of influence over its neighbors that it seems to think it should have. On the question of can China pull off this feat that it's trying, which is to become economically vibrant and entrepreneurial and market-based and driven at the same time, keeping tight political control over everything by having hundreds of thousands of people censoring the internet, by making choices within its economy to as in terms of which countries, which businesses will succeed, which will fail, which will be supported. I think most people think the answer is no. It can't pull it off. If it does choose to maintain its political power, which is certainly what Xi Jinping wants to do, then it will fall behind economically, and its economic growth rate will continue to go down. And so it can have tight control, but it won't have a very prosperous economy with the consequent benefits to its people. If it allows the sort of intellectual and communications freedom to its people that will really power the economy to continue to grow at a tremendous rate as it gets into the more difficult tasks of becoming a service economy, moving higher up the value chain in terms of what it does, then it will have to cede political power to other segments of society. So China is attempting a feat which no other countries have been able to pull off for a very long time that we've seen, and I think for the United States, we don't want to make a bet that it either can or it can't. We need to see what our interests are. We need to protect them where they need to be protected, but we should not assume that this Chinese experiment is going to go one way or the other and bet our policy on one or the other. We need a policy that can encourage the future that we would like to see, but has safeguards in case things go another direction. I think there was a question down here, sir. I always used to hate 2-hour lectures when I had to go to them, and when I was undergraduate, especially after dinner. You all are doing awfully well. So,
good evening, sir. Midshipman 4th Class Relag, Stanford University. My question is based on Indian neutrality. They've strived to, since their independence, keep a very neutral foreign policy. Do you think that's likely to change with the rise of China?
I'm sorry, who's very neutral policy?
India.
India. Well, if you talk to most Indians, they don't feel like they have a very neutral policy towards China. They feel challenged by it. There are 2 border disputes going on in their border with China. They feel very economically competitive with China, but they don't really see major war with China in their future. They more see economic and perhaps some minor military competition, and they certainly see the latest economic moves by China, the Belt and Road Initiative, which puts a big economic corridor coming down through Myanmar, another coming through Pakistan, huge Chinese investments and increased influence in India's neck of the woods as being a challenge to them. So I would say the Indians pretty well regard as China as somewhere between a challenge and a threat to the sort of future that India itself wants to pursue. So they follow a military policy and a political policy that's designed to safeguard their own interest and influence, check China where they can, but they also see that economically dealing with China is important, can be to the benefit of both sides, and so they pursue that. So I would say it's a mixed policy they have towards China with a healthy element of feeling that it's a competition and in some cases maybe even a threat. So I'd say it's a little bit more on that score that the Indians approach the Chinese rather than strict neutrality. Yeah.
Sir, Elizabeth Hall. I'm curious on your thoughts on the formidable Chinese air threat. Do you believe that the U.S. military, specifically naval aviation, is receiving enough funding and support to compete with a growing Chinese air threat? And who at this time has air superiority between the two nations?
Yeah, I mean, you have to think about all forms of combat in the context of where are you likely to face it, and therefore where do you have to deter it. I think there's a tremendous Chinese air threat if the United States is trying to invade China or conduct long-range manned bombing strikes into China. But I have a hard time thinking that we need to do that in the confrontations that I see with China, which would probably more involve the American commitments to support Japan in the case of the Senkakus, to support Taiwan in the case of an unprovoked Chinese attack on Taiwan, or a Chinese military move in the South China Sea. And in that point, it's a case of who can project air power out from China, in its case, in the United States, using a combination of Navy air operating from carriers and land-based air operating from bases from our allies and partners. And in that second matchup, we're still pretty good. And so, yeah, I think China can defend itself quite well if you try to fly planes to attack deep into their country. I think if it's a case of projected military power over a disputed area that's out over water or at some distance from China, then the United States pretty well dominates that. And that's a large part of the reason that it's extremely high risk for China to attempt to use military power to regain these territories that they think belong to them. And we need to keep it that way so that they sit down under a tree, the thought goes away, and then they work on other ways to try to increase their power and influence. Okay. Yep. One more. See, you've had two, so how about the gentleman in back of you?
Understanding that it's probably no longer your bailiwick, but as a former fellow of HUD, I wonder what kind of thoughts you might impart to Ben Carson if you had the opportunity.
Yeah. Man, that was so many years ago, and I don't think I have much wisdom to offer on housing policy, except it's complicated, and the sort of well-meaning efforts to spend money to affect something as basic as the way people live can have as many bad effects as it can have positive effects. So I sort of came away from my experience there thinking tread pretty carefully in terms of big government programs that operate on neighborhoods and housing. I'm not going to go any further without getting myself into trouble. And let me finish with another question on something that I know something about. Was there one more question in there? Yeah, in the back there, sir.
Because once you were a student of history, and because you're standing next to his picture, Admiral Nimitz, what role did his example play in your naval career as a leader?
What made him great as a leader? Is that the question? Oh, okay. Well, a couple of things. His leadership style, I always tried to emulate. He was, when you read the accounts of those who worked for Admiral Nimitz, they felt incredibly motivated, and it was primarily they didn't want to let him down. Not that he forced them, he told them exactly what to do and then punished them if they didn't do it. And that sort of leadership that relies on people wanting to do the right thing for you is something that I've always aspired to, and he continued that right through his Navy career. I mean, he took firm action, including disciplinary action when he had to, but by and large, people really liked working for him because he set the goals, he stuck to it, he supported his people, and so on. And so that's, on a personal level, that's sort of something I've always admired and tried to aspire to, not always successfully. As a fighting admiral, his job was fairly easy late in the war when the United States industrial machine was just churning out equipment in huge quantities, and we just overwhelmed the objectives that we set for ourselves. But in that first year or so after Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese were superior in both numbers and in capability for a time, and yet they had to be stopped in places like Coral Sea and Midway and so on. His calculation on when to hold them and when to fold them, when to commit forces, even though the outcome of the battle might be in doubt, as it was at both Midway and Coral Sea, ability to take losses and make it worthwhile. That was some of the finest high-level maritime strategy that there's been ever, and they were his decisions, and he had a limited number of forces to do it with, and he spent them well, and with a combination of the heroism and skill primarily of the sailors and the junior officers, but his own decisions on committing them, the United States turned the tide in that war incredibly quickly. The Battle of Midway, the decisive maritime battle of World War II, took place only 7 months after Pearl Harbor. Incredible. We have all of our battleships shot up. We're down to four carriers, 2 of which are shot up by the Battle of Coral Sea. Send them out, defeat a superior number of Japanese aircraft carriers, and from then on, it's all downhill for Japan. A hard downhill, a lot of fighting, a lot of death and destruction, but that was it. And he did that within 7 months of the time that he took command with a force that had been defeated badly at Pearl Harbor and was shaken by that defeat. So I guess those are the 2 things that I learned from reading about this guy. Never met him, never had the honor of meeting him, but the sort of leadership style that he brought, plus those decisions in the early months of his taking command are pretty exemplary. He's one of the real heroes, not only of American naval history, but really going back through the ages. Nice question to end on. Thanks very much.